Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning into today's live stream. We're going to be part 2 of our vulnerability management series. Today we're going to focus on mitigation. If you didn't have a chance to take a look and watch the part 1, head over to YouTube and watch it. Let us know what you think. Drop your comments. We'll have a brief Q&A following the presentation. So stick around, ask your hard questions for Mr. Langer. And we really look forward to engaging with you through this live stream. From here, I'll pass it over to Ralph.
Thanks, Braxton. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. In the last webinar, you should have learned 2 lessons. First, that manual vulnerability matching is useless. It's a waste of time because it leads to anecdotal mitigation, which basically is the same as security theater. The second lesson that you should have learned is that you have way much more vulnerabilities than you ever dreamed about in your worst nightmares. How much more? Well, you would know exactly if you look at your vulnerability or your CVE list in OT-base, because this tells you automatically these are all the CVEs that affect your installed base. So from the total of today, we are at roughly 250,000 CVEs. From the beginning of time until now. And in our sample database, which is populated by around about 6,500 devices that pretty much represent let's just say a typical small to mid-sized manufacturing facility, we are talking about roughly 12,000 CVEs that affect our installed base. And here is something very important. So far, you're talking about CVEs. But as soon as you bring in mitigation, that's a different story, because your 12,000 CVEs turn into many more problems that you have to mitigate, because a given CVE, let's just say like this first one that you see here, it affects 184 devices. And if we wanted to know how many instances of that CVE or of all the CVEs we would need to fix, well, we can just go over to the next table, which lists all the CVE instances for our devices. And then it gets really frustrating, because now you're talking about 677,000 and change vulnerabilities. So almost 700,000 vulnerabilities that you had to mitigate if you wanted to mitigate every known vulnerability. That is a fact, right? That is not fiction, that is a fact. And that already gives you an idea. Actually, this problem is a little bit different than I thought. It's not just that it's much bigger. It's also because of the magnitude that shifts into a new quality and into a new type of problem, because it tells you, well, you really need to define some strategy here, because we will never be able even to fix a tiny set of our problem space. So we really need to furnish a strategy when we actually want to achieve any meaningful results. And maybe the first takeaway that I want you to realize here is that you should try, based on this insight, you should try to avoid common fallacies. A very common fallacy would be, well, there is this new vulnerability. Let's just make sure that we mitigate this rather quick. So quite often, people new to the vulnerability management business in OT, they think they should monitor the incoming CVEs pretty much in real time, because then they would be able to mitigate all that stuff that's important rather quickly. So let me give an example. If we in OT base, we have this nice page here for events, and that will tell us about all the latest new CVEs that affect our installed base. And in this case, we are talking about 64 new CVEs that came in during the last week. And again, this is only about CVEs that affect our installed base. And the color code represents the CVSS base score. So the darker it is, the worse, right? The more problematic. And so an inexperienced vulnerability manager could, for example, say, oh, wait a second, no, this one, oh, this is important because it's about WinCC. That's the SCADA product from Siemens. So we definitely have to fix this one, okay? How would we do that? Well, you do a double click, then you see the details on this vulnerability, and you also see the affected devices, where they are, etc. So for example, here in my first listing, I say, oh, in Madrid, in building 1, I have this one Windows box that is affected by this vulnerability. Let's fix this rather quickly. Would that be a worthwhile approach? No, it would not be. And there is a simple reason for that. So that person would have fixed 1 or up to 4. So we see 4 devices are affected by this vulnerability. He or she would have mitigated those 4 vulnerabilities. But when we are talking about almost 700,000, that does not make a difference. And that is the big problem. So in a nutshell, you should always keep in mind vulnerability management is a numbers game in OT, and that is very much different from IT. In OT, you are plagued with so many vulnerabilities when it comes to mitigation that it is clear from the beginning you will only be able to mitigate a very small set with given resources within your lifetime. Right? So, because this is certainly, mitigation is always associated with an effort that needs to be put in. In OT, you cannot, most of the vulnerabilities cannot be mitigated automatically, like with your WSOS updates, etc., with automatic patching. That doesn't work, and therefore you have to be really, really deliberate in the result set that you pick and that you then mitigate in order to really make a difference, in order to achieve something that's worthwhile doing. And maybe how I see that from my experience, the biggest piece that most people miss is for your corporation, you need to define a useful mitigation strategy. And you will only be able to do that if you have a good idea of the big picture, right? Not by looking at the latest and hottest vulnerability, but by identifying the whole thing, the whole risk context, if you will. And that's actually quite intuitive because if you think about, for example, the task that you would have to provide physical protection for your house or for somebody else's home, right? And you do your inspection, and it turns out that the backyard windows are well, it's totally simple to break in. There are old windows, and you can open them or smash them in just like that. So you decide, well, we will just install new windows here with thick glass and whatnot, right? But unfortunately, you never bothered to check the front door. If you had done that, you would have seen, well, the front door has no lock. If you had known that, then certainly you wouldn't have spent time and money on fixing those backdoor windows, right? Because at least there was glass in them. Where the front door, if it is wide open, then that's obviously a bigger problem. And again, that tells you something very important about the whole risk mitigation or risk management process. You only get a realistic understanding of risk if you look at the totality of your subject under consideration. And that means if you single out your CVEs of choice or your devices of choice, that really doesn't result in risk management. So you really need to be able to see the big picture. And in that big picture, you might at first be overwhelmed. Well, I would imagine that some of you watching this live stream is, oh shit, 700,000 vulnerabilities that need to be mitigated. And in my case, it might even be more because we have, let's just say 10 plants all over the world and we have so many more devices. Well, then you will have more vulnerabilities. So you got to see the big picture. And in that big picture, you need to identify patterns that could yield some good angles towards mitigation. And in this webinar, I'm going to give you some examples. I'm trying to show you some angles, how this can be achieved. And you need to figure out for your individual situation, for your enterprise, what has the best chance of turning into useful results where you really make a difference, right? Because we are not doing vulnerability mitigation for its own sake, right? We want to see some progress when it comes to risk management. So let me give you some examples. Let's go back to this list here that you have seen earlier. This is a list of all the CVEs that affect our installed base. The one approach from several would be that you look at the CVEs. Another approach could be that you look at affected systems, and I will tell you in a couple of minutes how that works. But when looking at the CVE level, there are certainly a couple of differences that you can identify here. There are patterns in here, right? And one way to visualize those differences would be in OT-base. If you tell OT-base, well, you know what, show me a heat map of all those CVEs and how much they contribute to my risk. And this now looks, if you ask me, I think rather interesting, because every single object here represents one CVE from those 12,000. Okay, and the bigger the space is that this CVE consumes, the more devices are affected. And then there is this height that you also see, and then there is the color that gives you additional information. So color, as always in OT-base, represents the badness, the CVSS base score, which goes from 0 to 10. Okay, and the dark red, obviously, and you also see that in the background, that's the very high CVSS base scores, that's the very severe shit. And in this heat map, in this 3D heat map that I can now inspect, I can clearly see, well, you know, from my 11 or 12,000 CVEs, there are apparently some that are pretty heavy, like this guy right here. And when I hover over this, I would see, well, yeah, that's pretty bad because almost 250 devices are affected. We are talking about a base score of 9.3, and there are also criticality ratings for the affected devices, and 11 of those devices are exposed to the internet. Okay, and now here is where it gets interesting, I hope, for you. And in this graph, in this heat map, we have already started to also incorporate context data. And this is super important, right? So you will not be able to get any meaningful risk reduction by only looking at the CVEs. You also need to bring in context. And we have two very good context items that give us a lot of mileage for our risk management. And they're associated with the vulnerable devices. The first one that I want to single out is device criticality. That is assessed usually by a control engineer. And that criticality could have to do with safety, as an example. So if you are talking about, let's just say, an engineering station for a safety system, then if you ask me, I would say, well, yeah, that's a pretty critical system, right? You want to put some extra scrutiny on that particular device, right? Because the consequences could be devastating in the case of a compromise. And another example for criticality would be, well, this device has a particular criticality for business continuity, because if this thing malfunctions, then let's just say the whole site might experience downtime, or even worse, additional sites may also be affected because we have this supply chain integration, yada, yada, yada. Okay, and that could, for example, also be a network switch where somebody has determined, well, if this guy goes down, if it becomes unavailable, then we have a serious problem. If those other switches malfunction, well, that's not a big issue. Okay, so and if you bring in this context information from the devices, all of a sudden the picture gets more colorful, and it yields much better information that helps you with your mitigation efforts. So that would be one angle, right? To bring in this context information that we see later. But what I've focused on here is we are looking at vulnerabilities. And another approach would be to look at affected devices. Let's go back to those details here, where again, every single entry in this list is one CVE instance, one instance that you would have to mitigate, right? And for example, well, that's not looking nice here, all those vulnerabilities that affect VFDs, drives, actuators, okay? That is something, that is another angle. So, and here is a general observation that is very simple to explain. So from all your vulnerabilities, the vast majority will affect Windows systems. And there is a very simple reason for that. So it is not that all your automation gear would not have vulnerabilities. It's quite to the contrary, and I will get back to that later. But a VFD, as an example, what we're looking at here has only one piece of firmware, whereas a Windows PC is usually running hundreds of applications. And then there is the operating system with its own share of vulnerabilities. And then there is the fact that the majority of these Windows systems in the OT space are not updated and patched regularly. Okay, and for those reasons, the CVEs that you will see are mostly related to Windows boxes. And so that's important to keep in mind. I'll get back to that later. If you want to look at the actuators, the controllers, etc., and you certainly should. You could do that, for example, in this table. So let me give you an example. Let's just say I want to check rather quickly which vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, do my Siemens PLCs carry. All right, so from my small sample population here, I would see, oh, yeah, 1506. This is what I would have to mitigate for my Siemens controllers. And you would get some very similar results if you look at Rockwell, etc. So this has nothing to do with a specific vendor. My point is, this is another angle that you want to check out to identify the patterns in your big picture that will then ultimately result in mitigation strategies. Okay, so here you would see, oh, that's a whole bunch of boxes, and it doesn't stop with outdated, let's just say, CPU for 112. Yeah, that's some outdated stuff, but even the newer versions here, 317, they have their share of vulnerabilities. So that is another angle that you want to keep in mind. But in general, remember, you will see the bulk of the vulnerabilities associated with Windows boxes. As a major aspect of your vulnerability strategy, you will need to define some prioritization tactic. Because we have understood so far, well, we will only be able to mitigate a tiny fraction of your vulnerabilities. And still, the question becomes, even let's just say we focus only on 2,000. Oh, yeah, that would be great if we could only mitigate 2,000 of our 700,000 vulnerabilities within this calendar year, for example. you cannot mitigate them all at once, because let's just say, just in the case of these vulnerabilities that are associated with PLCs, well, this I can tell you what it requires. The mitigation requires a firmware update. And you cannot do that just like that, while your production is running. No, you will need to wait for a window where you have a scheduled outage, and then you can update your firmware. So you will have to prioritize. That is the name of the game. And the prioritization will yield a list, a sorted list, where the stuff that you want to focus on first is what you intend to mitigate first, because you and your peers agree, well, that's the toughest shit that we need to get rid of first, right? And that again, that will not be the latest vulnerability that Siemens or Rockwell or CISA or whomever has told you about. Because again, if you look at the big picture, oh shit, we have all these vulnerabilities from 2015 or whatnot, right? And they're so much more important. They create so much more risk. So you need to prioritize. And for that, you need an additional set of parameters. And now I'm trying to bring this together, what I have already touched on, like with the criticality, etc. And this is mostly about numbers. One number that you will throw out of the window right away is a CVE probability. This is just a big pile of nonsense. So you may have seen that in certain products of a specific technological persuasion. You see a probability associated with a CVE, like, well, this is probably maybe 0.5 that this device is actually has this vulnerability. That is plain and simple nonsense. CVEs don't have a probability associated with them. What you're seeing is an incomplete identification of the underlying product, right, of your installed base. So in that case, the OT security product has not been able to fully identify your endpoint. It might only know, well, that's Siemens PLC from the 400 series, but which model, which firmware, I don't know, right? So it might be affected by this vulnerability. And that is pure and simple nonsense. You cannot use this as the foundation of your vulnerability management in OT. So just throw that out of the window. You need some solid information, reliable information about those vulnerabilities that affect you. And once that you have that, one of the most common strategies would be, well, let's reduce this result set by focusing only on CVEs with a critical or high vulnerability rating. And then you can reduce your result set like this. So from 12,000, we go down to 8,500. Remember, I told you always in OT, always include high severity. If you don't include high, you are missing lots of CVEs with a base score of up to 10, but they're older. They're from a time when the critical severity rating didn't exist. So you will always include high severity in your result set. And certainly one thing that would even be easier, that you use the CVSS base score that you see here, displayed here. So if I want to resort by the base score, I only need to click on that. And then again, you see, all these CVEs in those first rows here, they have a severity rating of high. They're not critical because they're older, okay? But that doesn't mean that they're already mitigated or not important. So that is one angle, that you reduce the result set by focus by setting a deliberate threshold, like well, let's just look at the most severe stuff first, and we set the threshold at a CVSS base score of 8, for example, okay? And that would be very simple to do. So in OT base, you could simply say, oh, let's just say greater 8, bang. And then you will only say, no, it's fourth, still a lot. So let's just say greater 9. So and we got to be serious here. This is a useful and valid strategy here, because it doesn't help you. If you say, well, we in principle, we should mitigate all those CVEs with a base score higher than 8, but your result set is too big. You don't have the resources to actually mitigate those. And then you end up in frustration, right? Your result set must yield a quantity that you actually can address, that you have the means to actually mitigate. Otherwise, again, it's security theater, and you will simply end up in frustration. So that would be one way to approach this when you look at the CVEs, that you reduce your result set. And again, I mentioned that in the first part of the webinar, you can criticize the CVSS base score all day long, and I'm with you. So there is a lot of criticism that can be said about CVSS base scores. However, at this time, we don't have anything better. Using the CVSS base score as one parameter is certainly better than only focusing on severity, because it doesn't offer enough granularity. So severity is only critical, high, medium, and low. That is not good enough. In OT, you will always use the CVSS base score until we have something better. Okay, and now here is one of the most important parameters that really gives you a lot of mileage. And I've briefly addressed that in the first part of the webinar. That's this tiny button right here that is called KEV only, this checkbox. And if I check this box, oh, wow, my result set drops to 76. Well, now we are talking, right? Oh, that is something that I can really address. And what does that mean? Now I have reduced the result set to only include CVEs with known exploits. So that's a different dimension from anything we have discussed so far, right? So previously, well, the badness, or how bad that is with the base score, etc. But now we are talking about the probability that your devices with a particular vulnerability may actually be attacked successfully. Because if there is a known exploit for this CVE, well, then your probability goes up like this, because our friends on the hacker side of the universe, right? Most of them are just lazy sons of bitches, and they would rather not invest the effort to write new exploits. They would rather like to reuse existing exploit code. That makes their life so much easier. Okay, and therefore, as soon as you bring KEV in, that brings you a lot of bang for the buck, because now you're talking probability, which is super important, and I will get back to that later. That also reduces your list to an extent where now we got something that we can work on. And you can do the same thing in the details list, where I can also check this box. Let's get rid of the Siemens first here. We don't want to pester our good friends from Siemens here by suggesting that they would have the only one of our products. So 600 and almost 700,000 vulnerabilities that we will need to mitigate. When I check this box, oh, it's 23,500, 23,000 and something and change, right? Well, that's still quite a high number, but it's so much better than the 700,000. So this is a parameter, known exploited vulnerabilities, that you will always focus on first when putting your vulnerability management strategy into a plan, what you actually want to accomplish, let's just say next month or until the end of this year. Okay. Then the other thing that I had already addressed is the device context. So let's look at devices. Now we're approaching our mitigation strategy or efforts or risk from a different angle. We are looking at individual systems. And the list that you see here is a list of devices ranked by what could be their risk. And how is that calculated? It's calculated by a cumulated CVSS base score. So we take all the CVEs that a given device is plagued with, sum the CVSS base scores up. That is one parameter here in this list. That's what we call the V-score. And we also bring in two additional parameters that I've mentioned earlier. One is the criticality and the other is the exposure. So criticality, I mentioned that earlier, is the rating that usually some control engineer has slapped on the device. Well, you know, if this thing is compromised, we are in deep shit. And therefore, this device should be treated with priority when it comes to mitigation. And the second parameter is the network exposure, which in this case we see, oh, that's talking to the internet, this device. And you can always get additional details by doing a double click. And then we would see the individual details here for this device, like, again, all the vulnerabilities that by default there are only the ones shown with the known exploits, 103 in this case. And if I uncheck this box, actually I don't want to see all the, it's over 3,000 vulnerabilities. And don't get me wrong, this is not an outlier. In OT, you will see a lot of such devices. The reasons are very simple. I mean, I only need to look at the additional detail here in this page because I can see two things that stand out. First, the operating system, well, that's Windows 7. Yeah, I would have guessed that that this comes with problems. And second, if you look at this graph down here, this tells me the patch history of this device. Okay, all the security patches that have been installed or have not been installed. And what we see here is that this is hopelessly out of patch, this thing here. So last patch somewhere in 2019, and basically after 2016, the whole patching effort just vanished. Okay, so and I hope you understand well. This is another very important angle to identify your risk landscape and your vulnerability landscape, especially when it comes to mitigation. Then, right? Because if you would just mitigate this one device, well, that would already give you a lot of bang for the buck. So lots of different angles, and you will be able to identify what will yield the best results in the given amount of time. Always remember, in vulnerability management, you are always working against the calendar, because every single day, new vulnerabilities drop down from the sky that you have to deal with. So they add to your already existing huge mountain of CVEs that you carry along, right? Or your backlog of vulnerabilities. And it is increased every single day. And by which vulnerabilities? Well, again, I showed you earlier. I can see that right away. So in this page, in the events page, last week 64 new vulnerabilities. Let's just say we want to see in the last 24 hours what were all the vulnerabilities. 27, only the last 24 hours. And again, this is only vulnerabilities that affect this installed base. It's not like everything, because then the number would be much higher. Okay, so now let's look at a different angle. Now let's bring in the threat landscape, and we can, for a moment, get rid of the screen sharing here. I don't want to distract you. So you used to learn every so often that you should focus on consequence first, right? So my good friend Dale Peterson, this is one of his major talking points. Well, you gotta do your risk management consequence based, right? If you look at the work by INL with their also consequence oriented mitigation strategies, so that is an established and valid approach in OT. So I don't want to criticize that. But what I want to do is I want you to acknowledge that there might be other angles towards your mitigation strategy that are worthwhile as well. And here is what I mean by that. If you look at the big picture, when it comes to threats, when it comes to actual accomplished cyber physical attacks or cyber attacks in the OT space, what do you see? Well, over the last, let's just say 10 years, right? We didn't see any cyber physical attacks worth mentioning. Oops. Oh, maybe with one exception in Ukraine. 2015 in Ukraine, widely documented. Even you will find, I think, at least one video by myself on our YouTube channel. Yes, but that was one attack. Okay, but we still get the point. Consequence-based, critical infrastructure, yada yada yada. However, what type of attack did we see a lot? Which type of attack do we see almost every week? You know what it is. Come on. Ransomware. Ransomware in the OT space. So just yesterday, it was published that Schneider, Siemens Energy, AbbVie have fallen victim to ransomware, right? Oh, damn. And as I just bet that all the asset owners that listen to this web live stream, that's a big concern for us, because this is real. All those talks about the high consequence cyber physical attacks, yeah, we get it, we understand it, but this is not something that you would see every week, every month, not even every year. You see that every couple of years globally at a global scale. But every asset owner has experience. Oh, shit, that's in our neighborhood. That was close, right? So our peer was successfully attacked by a ransomware campaign. That is the new normal, and that's not cyber physical. And what does this tell us for our vulnerability mitigation? First, I would certainly not say, oh, these are also OT attacks. No, they are not. They're IT attacks that we need to worry about. IT attacks on OT environments, okay? So please, let's be very clear. Things like Colonial Pipeline, they are not OT attacks. You would fool yourself. If you don't believe me, please watch the 1 or 2 videos that I did on the topic on our YouTube channel. Why Colonial Pipeline, Maersk Hydro, etc. Why those were not OT attacks? Well, I can give you the punchline right here, because no OT equipment, no controllers, etc. were affected. But anyhow, the new reality, the new normal is you have to encounter ransomware attacks in your IT space, in your OT space, excuse me. So IT attacks that somehow make it into your OT environment, not because the attackers were actually intending to do that. The vast majority, if not pretty much every ransomware attacks, those are opportunistic attacks, not like intentional on purpose, like they wanted to attack Siemens Energy because they were on the radar for a long time. They just had it coming, so to speak. No, that's not how that works. So opportunistic attacks that take advantage of the given attack surface. And if you let that sink in, this will most likely tell you, maybe we should actually put some additional weight on mitigating those Windows boxes. Remember, I told you earlier, this is what makes for the vast majority of your CVEs in the OT space. It's about all those outdated operating system versions the shit that you have installed there without even knowing about it, such as Adobe Acrobat, or excuse me, Adobe Flash Player that drags along hundreds of vulnerabilities per instance. So I'm just saying, for ransomware attacks, you create a target-rich environment. And here is the punchline. You have been told over and over again, focus on consequence. You want to make sure that this catastrophic consequence cannot happen. Yeah, I get it. However, you should also factor in probability. And this is what used to be ignored. If you do that, probability of getting attacked, even though the consequence might not be a disaster, like, well, people die, like the horror scenarios that the threat boys always try to frighten you with, right? The critical infrastructure and everything goes to shambles. You will see explosions, poisoned water supply, etc. That's one thing. But the other thing is, should you be worried about successful ransom attacks? Well, certainly you should. And because from a probabilities perspective, presently, this is top of the list. And you have a target-rich environment because of all your outdated Windows operating systems and all the other software products. Windows Office comes, again, with its share of vulnerabilities. And if you didn't bother to patch because you said, well, that's only for my electrical engineers, they have their office environment, and why should we update to new versions, etc. Well, here's why. Because you are creating an opportunity with all those vulnerabilities, many of which come with known exploits. So this is one piece of advice that, in my opinion, is actionable, that you should take away from this webinar. This should be very high on your list. Consider the probability of getting attacked. Consider the probability of falling victim to an opportunistic ransomware attack that might not have catastrophic consequences, but it will make you look very, very bad in respect to management, to your customers, stakeholders, etc. Right? And you might experience an unplanned outage as a result of that. It might only be a couple of days, but still, you don't want to have that. Then let's talk about vulnerabilities that might not be worth mitigating. So here is where most of the CVEs come into play that affect your automation gear, like all your PLCs, RTUs, etc. If you inspect the majority of those CVEs, which we have done, right? And you can certainly do that too once you have an automated vulnerability management system. You will not fail to identify, well, most of these vulnerabilities are associated with embedded web servers. Apparently, it is too much of a challenge for mere human beings to come up with a web server that is pretty much bulletproof. Okay, that is what you have to consider. So anytime you know that your PLCs, etc., have embedded web servers, my best advice would be just disable the damn thing. If you can. Where you cannot, well, then you know that thing will almost definitely have some known vulnerabilities. If it doesn't have it, it will have in the future with the next update that you get, right? And don't forget, new software versions or new firmware versions, not just fix vulnerabilities, they also come with new vulnerabilities. So most of those CVEs will be associated with embedded web servers, cross-site scripting opportunity, etc. Damn, and that could even come with a high CVSS base score, because it would allow an attacker to basically take control of that thingy. Is it worthwhile to mitigate, which in the case of this type of gear involves a firmware update? Guess what? It's not. How could that be? Now that, let's just say CVSS base score of 9, bad bad stuff. Why would you not bother mitigating that? Well, there is a very simple reason for that. Because all your PLCs, RTUs, etc., your actuators are vulnerable. They're insecure by design. They're vulnerable per se because of the technology they're using, and that technology would be Ethernet IP, Profinet, Modbus, you name it, right? So that is the bad news, one of the bad news in this webinar here. That probably will mostly surprise the IT folks. OT control engineers, they know that for decades. It's a known fact. That should not surprise anyone. The technology that we're using in the automation world for decades is vulnerable by design, and it will stay this way. Right, and again, Dale Peterson, he fights a courageous fight for this cause. Well, you know, you really should do a better job. We should introduce authenticated industrial protocols. Yes, he's absolutely right about that, but nobody's doing it because of the associated cost. And cost is always the important factor at the end of the day when it comes to OT security. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. But getting back to our vulnerable embedded web servers, if we know as a fact that any malware or rogue device on a control network, on a process network, could manipulate, control your process right away without needing any type of CVE, why would you then bother to update your firmware to fix that cross-site scripting vulnerability in the web server that is embedded into your PLCs? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't yield any benefits when it comes to risk management, because only the most idiotic attacker would write malware that exploits this cross-site scripting vulnerability. They would have to be total idiots, right? And total idiots usually don't even manage to write functional exploit code. So they, the average attacker would know, oh no, once that I'm in your Ethernet IP, once that I'm in your Profinet, I can pretty much do whatever I want. I don't need CVEs anymore. Yeah, I know some viewers will now be a little bit frustrated and desperate, but that's the reality of it. And that's one other very, very important lesson that you should take away from this discussion here. Your CVEs are unfortunately only one part of the problem. The other part is the insecure by design problem. So in a way, I could even go so far and tell you, well, as soon as it comes to automation gear, you can pretty much forget about the CVEs, because now you are in insecure by design territory. And what does that actually mean? Well, I think the practical consequences are pretty clear. It's not so difficult to figure out. When it comes to your automation gear, your best bet is access control, and that means network segregation, right? That is our weapon of choice against those pesky hackers. That is what gives you the best mileage for your mitigation efforts. Well, certainly you can update your firmware here and there, but again, it's not worth it. It's a totally different thing when you do a firmware update because you have received a vendor notification. Well, you know, there is a bug in this firmware and that could be safety relevant for your safety gear. There is a bug in this firmware that could have a business continuity impact because then your PLCs might stop under certain conditions, etc. That is something that I would imagine every control engineer would try to fix right away, and then that's also something that a good asset inventory will help you with to make it happen rather quickly. But firmware updates for vulnerability management, no. That's not something that you would entertain because you don't have enough resources anyway. So in OT vulnerability management, you never have enough resources to. So this is why the prioritization is so important. So that basically brings us to the end when it comes to mitigation strategies. Consider focusing on network segregation where your automation gear is affected, and consider to put a strong focus on all your exposed outdated Windows boxes. Let me give you another angle here. So let's go back to the to our workflow. Another angle that you should have in your bag of tricks. So what we see here is a prioritized list or a ranked list of software products that we have installed in our sample environment. And we can see here how much each software product contributes to risk because we have computed this V-score, so this vulnerability score, which basically takes all the CVSS base score, accumulates it, etc., for the affected devices. So for the devices that are actually vulnerable, they are not patched yet, etc. Right? So this is actionable intelligence, and so this list tells me right away the one product that contributes most to your attack surface, the one software product, well, that's Windows 7 Enterprise. Okay. And I'm talking about 72 devices that still have this operating system version. Where are these devices? I see that down here. So I have 10 in Flat-Rock as an example. And well, in the body in white building, and I can see right away where those boxes are. And based on that, I could furnish my vulnerability management strategy, which in this case would simply be, well, upgrade those damn boxes to Windows 10. Try to avoid Windows 11 because from my personal experience, it comes with its own share of problems, not necessarily security related, but you would want to upgrade to a current operating system version, and that would give you some measurable benefits when it comes to risk reduction. Look at this one, Adobe Flash Player, the third highest product that we have in our installed sample database here, contributes third most to the overall risk. Where do we have that piece of shit installed? Yeah, 10 devices in Flat-Rock, happens to be in the same building, etc. Just get rid of it, guys. No, it's called system hardening. That's and that's one of the best mitigation strategies, rather than keep patching and patching those products. If you don't need them, simply get rid of them, deinstall them, and then the problem is gone for once and for all. So that is basically what I wanted to share, and that leaves us with 8 minutes for a Q&A, if there are any questions.
Doesn't look like there's any questions today. Definitely encourage everybody that has watched and will watch the recording of this later to head over to the website to learn more about the vulnerability management offering that OTBase has. From there, if you have questions as a follow-up, I did drop a link to engage with us in the chat. So feel free to schedule a meeting with us. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today.
Okay, bye-bye, guys.